Year, everyone. Welcome to our winter installment of webinars. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker to you. James Mehta holds an MBA from Concordia University and a Bachelor of Engineering in Mechanical Engineering from McGill University. He started off his career as an R&D engineer at B.Eng and analyst at Bombardier Aerospace. Later, he was a project manager at the RIMUHC, where he managed and helped launch the Clinical Innovation Platform, CIM, a med tech startup incubator. Thereafter, he was the Associate Director of Stakeholder Relations for NeuroHub, a software platform developed by McGill neuroscientists, where he marketed and commercialized the platform. Currently, as a technology transfer manager at McGill University, he helps protect and commercialize intellectual property generated by McGill researchers. His domain of expertise is medtech, clean tech, and deep tech. So welcome. And just a small reminder, if you do have any questions in the room, please ask me for the microphone because it is a hybrid seminar and people on Zoom will not hear you unless you speak into the microphone. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, my name is James. I'm Technology Transfer Manager here at McGill. I want to give a little brief introduction to our unit, who we are, where do we exist within the McGill ecosystem. So we're part of the Office of Innovation and Partnerships at McGill. We kind of have three divisions within our team, and there's a new one not included in this slide, but we have one division which is all about developing relationships with industry sponsors, bringing in research funding from companies. And there's our team where we do technology transfer, which is protect intellectual property and then license it off into companies. We have our own division here, which does the research agreements with industry sponsors. And there's a new team which is called Research Security, which is all about protecting researchers, doing conflict of interest, and things related to that. On to the next slide. Oh, it doesn't seem to be working. On. Maybe I'll. Yeah. Perfect. So although we're based out of McGill, we actually handle the IP for all of McGill and all the hospitals as well. So we handle for McGill, the RIMUHC, the Jewish, the Douglas, and the Neuro as well. And this is really, to centralize one office to handle IP across the whole McGill ecosystem. So there's, clarity of service across all of McGill, and so there's no siloing. So really, it doesn't matter if you're at a hospital or you're a student at McGill, it's all within our office, and we do all of the IP disclosures. So here's our team. We have around 9 people, and it's grown quite significantly. And there's some people like myself who are engineers, but there's also people on the life science side who are really PhDs in genomics. Some people who have PhDs in chemistry, machine learning. So we really have a diverse team that able to handle inventions of any caliber, and we really focus it depending on what the invention calls for. We're not siloed into who's in the faculty of medicine, who's in engineering. It really depends on your competency. And we also have one person who's dedicated for patent searches as well. I want to introduce one person who's joined really recently. That's Salma Wang. She's actually our technology transfer manager who's going to be dedicated for the RIMUHC exclusively. So she's on Zoom right now, but in the future, you'll see her doing this presentation instead of me at Core. So yeah, if you please reach out to her if you have any questions, or to me as well. So what does tech transfer do? So I like to tell people that I want you to think of us as your first investor. So when you have an idea, we'll be the first people to actually put money put money towards patents ahead of anybody else. So we'll pay for all the patent costs associated with protecting an invention, if there is needed. You also get access to some exclusive funding opportunities in order to develop your research further. Those can be both internal, like the McGill Innovation Fund, which puts money towards research projects and startups. But there's also some exclusive external funding opportunities that are really geared towards doing commercialization research as opposed to doing fundamental. We'll also evaluate your technology. We'll make sure, is there actually a market? Is it patentable? Is this even worth your time and our time in order to move it forward? And if yes, we'll help you advise on the product development timeline because at the earliest stage, it's usually quite early and not developed. I mean, we'll work with you on how to validate it and get enough data that makes it attractive to an industry partner. Finally, we'll help commercialize your technology. So we'll go out there, we'll find licensees, we'll negotiate agreements, we'll handle payments, and everything on that side as well. So why do we do technology transfer, and why do universities care about this? Well, before technology transfer offices were put in universities, technology was really hard to get out of the lab, and a lot of it went nowhere. So this is really helping bridge the gap from bench to bedside in order to take fundamental research or research that you have in, at your lab all the way to a patient. It also helps increase the public impact of university inventions. And I tell researchers a lot this, and they're very surprised that 3/4 of all technical information in the world is found in patents and not in publications. It's because there's way more companies out there and way more people working in R&D companies than researchers. So this is really, if you have a patent under your name, it really increases the impact of your invention, and it's a way of disseminating it. It also attracts sponsors. So when you have a history of patents or new technology, you can actually bring in more research money. And oftentimes, when we license to a company, they'll actually put money in your lab to develop it further. Also, increase the prestige. So having patents under your name is incredibly valuable. And if you're a student, chances are you're probably going to want to go out into the industry and get a job. And companies care way more about patents than they do about publications. So if you have an issue patent on your name, this is very attractive to potential future employers. And finally, it can make money. A lot of it is early stage. It's really high risk, high reward. So it may not make money, but those that do actually usually make quite a bit of change, especially in the life science area. So I want to give a brief overview of intellectual property. What is it and how do you protect it? So intellectual property is any product of human intellect, and that'll be important later on with AI, that is unique, novel, non-obvious, and valuable. There are many forms of intellectual property protection. The three most that we care about is utility patents. I think a lot of people know what a patent is. It protects an idea. It gives you exclusivity over it over a certain period of time. Copyright protection, trade secrets, and know-how. There are other forms like design patents, but they're not really relevant in academic context. So a patent, what it does is it gives you an exclusive right to be the only person that's able to benefit from the commercial use of an invention. There's a quid pro quo there. You get this exclusive right, but you have to fully describe what your invention is, how does it work, and how to use it or manufacture. And you get 20 years to have this exclusivity, and afterwards it goes in the public domain. Anyone can use it. They're usually very expensive, and the reason being is that they're national in scope. So you have to file patent protection in every single country you wanted it, and this can add up significantly over time. Some examples of what can be patented. It could be, a product like this clicker here. It's a machine, it's a device, it's a structure. It can also be a composition of matter, so you can make a drug or a molecule. Nothing that exists in nature, like you couldn't patent the element zinc, but you can patent a combination of that, a new molecule, anything related to that. Finally, you can patent a process. So like the process to manufacture this clicker, the use of this clicker to change slides. These are really useful in some cases, but they're often very hard to enforce. So, patents related to the structure of a device are a lot more easy to enforce as opposed to a process. And actually, a lot of companies that have processes, they don't patent them for that reason because it's hard to enforce and really prove that someone used your specific process. It's also easy to reverse engineer after that. Finally, can be an improvement. So if you have this device, but you make an improvement that's novel, non-obvious, and unique, then that can also be patented. Copyright protection is, something you usually think about when you're copyright protecting a book, song, or piece of literature, but you can actually apply to software code. So most software code is covered under copyright protection. The advantage here is it's automatic. So as soon as you write that code, it's your copyright, and it restricts people from duplicating it. The only exception here is if you put it out into public use, you make it open source, then it's kind of gone and anyone can use it. But most code falls under that. AI is complicated. Some AI algorithms can be patentable, some cannot. So most of it falls under copyright. But if you really develop a new AI algorithm that does something very unique, very non-obvious, you can protect it. But it's difficult and it's evolving fast in the law. It's evolving much faster in the patent landscape. There's the new rulings related to what algorithms are protected. For example, before the products of an AI algorithm were not considered protectable. Like if you ask ChatGPT to generate an image that doesn't fall under copyright protection, but now there's been new rulings where if you put input into that, you change a little bit, then it could be. So it's really something that's evolving. You have to keep up with. Something to note though is if you have an AI algorithm, especially in the medical landscape, is you're going to train it on data. And a lot of the data that you're training on is from data sets that are only used for research purposes or can only be used for research. So you can train your AI algorithm on that data, but if you want to actually make it into a product and sell it to people, you then have to separate what data you trained it on and then find a commercial data source where you can do that. So that's a bit of a difficulty from translating an AI algorithm from a research context into a commercial context. Like I said, some AI algorithms can be patented, but the trend nowadays is actually to keep them secret. And what's a trade secret? Well, it's really anything that the public doesn't know about. So it covers anything. It could be unpatented inventions, could be formulas, could be drawings. It could also be something that could be patentable, but you don't want to patent, like those AI algorithms. Or a good famous example is Coca-Cola. So Coke could definitely patent the formula for Coke, but they don't want to be in business for 20 years. They want to be in business for 2,000 years. So they keep it secret. In the terms of an academic context, most of our trade secrets are really improvements or things that are not quite patentable. And it's actually realistically very problematic to license trade secrets. And the reason being is you have to keep it secret, right? So eventually you probably want to publish on it. If you're licensing a trade secret, you can't. So it's quite problematic. That's why we focus more on doing something that's patent protection protected or under copyright. So here's the criteria to patent something. So it has to be new and novel, and that also means that you haven't published it. So once you publish your invention or anything related to your invention, you've invalidated patenting in most of the world. There's only very few jurisdictions out there which give you a grace period. That's Canada, US is the notable example, and it gives you a 1 year grace period to file a patent. This happens a lot. This is probably our number one problem. Honestly, people will come to us and say, "Hey, I have this new invention. I think it's really valuable, and I just presented it, last week." Ah, you're now invalidated everywhere, right? So if it's like a molecule, like a small molecule, like a drug, you need very large, broad protection all over the world. Um, so this kind of inhibits the value. Some technologies, the market is only in the US, so it's not doesn't work. It's not that bad, but this is probably our number one problem. So if you do have an idea, you think it's valuable, consider delaying those publications, talking to us first, and that way maybe protect it. It has to be non-obvious as well. So this one's a bit harder to ascertain, but essentially someone who's skilled in the field, it wouldn't be obvious for them to do it. And this could be things like if you have two technologies, they put them together and it comes up with an obvious result, that could be invalidated as well. But this is really case by case basis. So you have to make that assertion. Finally, it has to be useful. So it actually has to have to work, and you have to prove that it works. So you have to have data that backs it up. Then finally, you have to fully describe how and why your invention works. If you come up with a discovery, you have no idea why it works, it's going to be hard to protect it. And finally, you have to be the first person to file. So, who's an inventor on a patent? And there's a legal definition of who an inventor is. And often, what people do is they'll write a paper, right? And they'll say, "My invention's fully described in this paper," and they'll put the inventors as all the authors of a paper. This isn't the case because inventor has to be someone that contributed to the conception of the idea. And on a paper, you would often include people who reduce the invention to practice, like manufacture, tested it, and got data. but they're not considered an inventor. So you really have to figure out who contributed to developing the invention and who did the experimental process, because you'll have to separate them eventually. So at McGill, it's up to the inventors themselves if they want to include the contributors. They may not be on the patent themselves, but you could still actually give them a piece of the revenue if you ever commercialize it. So here's a traditional or a traditional patent timeline. The patents don't always go in this process, but here's one that we usually do. So often we do something called a provisional application. And this is something you can do in a few countries, notably the US, where you provisionally describe the invention, and then you have 12 months to actually file a full patent application. This is really useful because with a provisional application, you can actually add content later on. So because our inventions are usually very early stage, we do provisionals quite often. And then later on, we can file a full patent application. And you could skip directly to this step right here where you file individually in every single country you want, but it gets pretty expensive. So often we do is something called a PCT application. This is an international patent. It doesn't give you really any advantages. You don't have protection internationally. But what it does give you is 18 months to decide what you want to do. And often this is the period where we actually license that technology to a company. And once we license that technology to a company, they can tell us where they want that patent protection in. Because at this point, sometimes we're just guessing. And if you look at the cost associated with a patent, there's a cost advantage as well. So provisional application, $6,000 right away. And then a PCT, it's $15,000. And then eventually, when you want to file nationally, let's say you want to do US, Canada, Europe, Japan, it's $50,000. Right. So you could skip directly to step three right here and file in all those countries. You could probably save a little bit of money, but it's not really worth it. But patents are very expensive, right? So over the life of those patents, they'll cost about $200,000. So your hurdle rate is, can I make at least $200,000 to get back my costs? So if you're thinking about commercializing invention, you don't think you're going to make that much money, that gives you an answer whether you want to move forward or not. So here's a technology transfer process at McGill. This is how we handle inventions and invention disclosures. So there's two policies at McGill related to who owns an invention. There's a policy on copyright, policy on inventions and software. So I mentioned that software falls under copyright. However, for the McGill policy, they do make a distinction whether copyright really refers to your publications or things like related to that. So related to your publications, whoever writes it, they own it. Relates to inventions and software, it's actually co-owned between McGill and the inventors. And it applies to anyone who's paid by McGill, is working on a research project that's funded, using a McGill account, or if you're doing a thesis. It doesn't apply to students who are doing work as a part of a course. For example, if let's say you're doing a course and you excuse me, say you have a course and you invent something, that IP belongs to you. But if you develop, of course, of a research project, then the IP belongs to McGill and the researchers themselves. So let's say you want to commercialize that invention. You have two paths. Either McGill does it for you, or you can do it yourselves. Most people go through path one. The reason being is that McGill will pay for all the patent costs, will give you aid in terms of finding licensees, but you can do it yourselves. And in that case, McGill will transfer the rights back to the inventors. Then you can pay for the patent costs and you can do whatever you want. Here's how the revenue cost sharing works depending on those two paths. So the first path, because McGill is paying for the patent costs, it takes 40% of the revenue that's generated. In the case where the inventors manage the commercialization, it'll only take 20%. And that really is to recoup the costs and time related to managing invention. Sure. That's a good question. So, like I mentioned, the McGill office handles the IP for all the hospitals as well as McGill. So, as a part of that 40%, we share it with the RI. So, we'll share half of it. So the R that's how the RI gets its chunk. It doesn't have a dedicated office for IP. It uses the McGill office, and then we give them half of the revenue. I'm not sure if they used to. To my knowledge, that yeah. So the question for those online is, wasn't there two processes between the RI and McGill? And the answer is, to my knowledge, there wasn't. Um, Maybe in the past, but this is the process right now. McGill does not. Sorry, the RI does not have a dedicated office to handle intellectual property. They use McGill. They also use the McGill IP policies as well. So there's no distinction between them. Here's some of the IP policies from Canadian peers. So you see at McGill, the IP policy is that the inventors get the first $10,000 made, and then it's 60/40 later on. Toronto is very similar. And then other universities, I actually think have, not as advantageous IP policies in terms of the inventor. So most of them are around 50/50. University of Alberta is one third. Ottawa is a little bit better if you make under $100,000, but afterwards it's not as favorable. And most U.S. universities they only give about one third of the royalties to inventors. So I actually think McGill is in a position, a competitive advantage when it relates to incentivizing researchers to create IP and commercializing. So the first step of commercializing an invention is really to file disclosure. This relates to whether you want to do it on your own or you want to do it through McGill. The reason being is that because the invention's co-owned, we have to know about the invention, then we can assign it to you. Otherwise, we can do it for you. So a lot of people ask us, when should I actually file this disclosure? Oftentimes, they'll come to us a little bit early. I've even gotten like napkin drawings. So you can't be that early. You have to have some data to support your invention, really reduce it to practice. Like if you have a prototype that works really well. But if you're too late, someone might beat you to it. And oftentimes, this is the researcher themselves. It's very, very rare that someone comes up with the same idea as you and patents before you or publishes before you. Oftentimes, you'll do it yourselves. So what we like to say is you need to have a balance between your preparedness and timeliness. And when you're working on a paper and you have a draft of the paper, that's when you should come to us because that will give us enough time to actually review it, figure out if it's patentable, and then we can patent before it's published. And oftentimes, even if there's a bit of a delay, we've talked with journals and say, hey, we want to patent something. Do you mind holding off for a few months? And almost always they say yes. So, and then when you have that draft publication, you have almost a manuscript which you'll need for a patent application. So when you're doing that, if it's a rough draft, send it to us. Happy to look at it. We have a criteria for patenting. We won't patent everything and anything. Unfortunately, we don't have an unlimited budget. Um, so we do have to pick the winners. So that has a good likelihood of commercial success. So like I mentioned, will it hit that $200,000 hurdle, right? If you're not going to get back that much money, there's kind of no point doing it. Do you have good freedom to operate? So if you look at the patent landscape, what does it look like? Is it a very crowded space? Is there a lot of patents, a lot of technologies that are competing with you? What are the strength of patent claims? So like I mentioned before, you have your structural claims and your process claims. If it's just like a process or a use, it is very weak and it's hard to enforce. If you really have like the molecule, like the composition of matter, for instance, that's very strong. So we'll look at that as well. Finally, are you, for most patent offices, you have, a 20-year period where you have to report to them, respond to the patent office, because there will be things called office actions where they'll challenge the novelty of your invention. So if you are, participating in the process, you're, helping us respond to that, that goes a long way. If you just want to be hands off, it's going to be very difficult for us to actually protect the patent later on. And then finally, are there any grant requirements that restrict us commercializing? And this really only happens with sponsored research. So sometimes a company will sponsor research, they'll have an exclusive option to license technology to them, or sometimes they'll own it completely outright. So you really have to look at what are your funding sources, related to this project, who has rights over it. So here's kind of a typical technology transfer process. And you don't always go like this, but here's a good example. So you have an idea. You'll test the idea, you'll do a proof of principle testing. Maybe you'll make a prototype. You think, hey, this works. I think I have something. So you'll report an invention to our office. We'll do an IP evaluation, figure out if it's patentable, market evaluation. Is this worth actually pursuing and commercializing? And typically our IP protections are go, no go gauge. And then after you patent, you're free to publish. We'll work with you on a development plan, like, what kind of data do you need to make it attractive to the market? So do you need simulations? Do you need preclinical data? Do you need clinical data? And nowadays, having clinical data is very important for commercializing medical devices. A lot of medical device companies are very risk adverse, and they want to have some sort of preliminary clinical data before making a decision. And the idea here is to license to a company, or you can actually create your own startup. So you can have your startup at the very beginning of the process. You want to, commercialize on your own. But later on, if, during the process of patenting and going through the commercialization process, and you decide, hey, I want to make a startup, that's no problem. We're happy to support you. So typically, the founders are the inventors of the technology, and we would license the IP to your company. There's a lot of incubators at McGill that help support that. So there's McGill Engine, there's a clinical innovation platform, um, there's Dobson. But what we need is actually a business plan to make sure we have a plan to actually commercialize it, and then we'll typically license it for equity, royalties, and milestones. So there's a couple types of IP sharing agreements out there. Often what we do is exclusive licenses. It's the most popular, but there's different forms. So starting with the agreements that give you the most control, something called a material transfer agreement. This is really just almost like a sale order. So you can like sell a cell line to a company, but you're not giving up rights to the technology, you're just providing it to them. Then you have non-exclusive licenses. So typically it's used for software, where you give people the non-exclusive right to use it, or the non-exclusive right to use it so you can license it to many people. Exclusive is really licensing it to one person within a very particular field. And you have a copyleft, Creative Commons license. This is really usually for software publications. You still have ownership over it, but anyone can really use it. And then finally, you have your assignment, which is when you sell the technology completely. We try and avoid these, with the early stage technology, but we do them. So to transfer ownership completely to a company, and you really lose most of the control over it. Although there's some restrictions, like they have to report to you and things like that. And then finally, if you make it open source, then you have absolutely no control over it anymore. Anyone can use it. They do not need to cite you. They not need to pay you for it. So if you're working on software and you make it open source, you put it on GitHub, it's gone, and you really can't commercialize it. So be very careful. It's very, very, very difficult to commercialize open source. So if you do want to commercialize it, you're thinking, try and make it closed source, or at least most of the components closed source. So what are some of the opportunities right now in the market for commercializing? This is really going to be specific to medtech and digital health. So if you look at the US and EU medical device companies, the revenue has been increasing every single year, right? Looks fantastic. However, when you look at their R&D spend as a proportion of their revenue, it's decreased substantially. So there's a lot of M&A activity at the at the beginning of the decade, from 2013 to about 2017. This has really dropped off in recent years. And a lot of it has to be explained with actually interest rates. So with interest rates increasing, less money to venture capital, but also profitability related to medical device companies has been decreasing. They have to do a lot of cuts. They're actually spending more, mergers and acquisitions. Mergers and acquisitions. So this is when they're acquiring companies, often be startups. And what they're doing in the past is that they're acquiring a lot of startups to increase their portfolio of products. Now they're actually concentrating on a very specific portfolio, and they realize that increasing the portfolio hasn't really increased their profitability, and now they're reducing their portfolio and concentrating on their core competencies, and actually increase their internal R&D percentage. So this is providing some some problems related to launching startups in the medical device field, but they do, and they, a lot of it is challenging. So, for instance, if you look at the North America venture capital volume, it's really fallen off a cliff after 2022, and global M&A across industries for VC-backed startups has also decreased significantly. So right now, it's not a great time to launch a startup, although you can see through the graph here through the end of mid-rate through 2024, the venture capital volume has increased, so it is getting better. But this actually gives an advantage to us because there's going to be a huge gap in terms of innovation because of this. It's going to create about a 2-year lag, and it gives us some opportunities to look at the needs in the market right now and actually invent stuff for later on when the market improves. But medical device innovation is really challenging. And the reason is that customers are incentivized to reduce their costs, right? So a lot of new medical devices now have to have cost leadership positioning. Making a new medical device that's more expensive to have better outcomes is a hard sell. If you can improve costs with the same outcomes, or even better, reduce costs and improve outcomes, this will really increase the value of a medical device. I'm not saying that you can't sell it, but it's going to become more and more difficult because of this. The regulatory process is very capital and time intensive. So incremental improvements are really hard. You have to have technology that's really novel or reduce the class of it. So for medical devices, you have class 1 to 4 in Canada. You can reduce a class from class 3 to class 2. You can reduce the time and capital required to get through the regulatory process significantly. And finally, what we noticed is that a lot of the medical device companies, they really want to favor licensing after clinical data is obtained. We had a lot of conversation with them. They're really interested in participating in early stage, but they won't license it. They want to have that preliminary clinical data. That's difficult to happen within an academic context, honestly. So if you're thinking about developing a new innovation, try and de-risk it, right? Because trying to get a class 3 device approved for a preliminary clinical trial, it's difficult. Class 1, very easy. Class 2, a lot easier as well, especially in Canada. Some of the big opportunities right now, no surprise, digital health, AI, and connectivity. I went to a conference a few months ago. This is really the number one thing everyone was talking about. They wanted to improve their digital health portfolio. They're saying we want to have AI, although they didn't really focus on what AI was or how it actually helped their business. Also, a big one was connectivity. So connecting different devices within their portfolio, kind of like being an Apple, where the devices only communicate with themselves to try and increase their dominance within a particular hospital. A lot of innovation, ambulatory care outside of traditional channels like hospitals. This is really brought on by the aging population. Just want less doctors. They want to have more at-home care, which is really this ties into digital health as well. And finally, like I mentioned, a lot of the medical device companies are increasing their concentration on their core competencies. So if you can really find a gap within their core competencies, make an invention, this will be a really easy sell. So some key takeaways here are really figure out what the unmet need is first. This usually isn't really a problem in the life science field because you're very needs focused, but really find that need first. Figure out what your solution's competition is and prior art and positioning ahead of time and how that positioning might change over time. If a lot of applications exist for your technology, really focus on one and focus on the one with most explosive growth as opposed to trying to tackle too many problems. Also, don't be too quick to publish. So everyone hears publish or perish, but it's publish and perish with patenting. And know that from the start. And if you're just starting like your master's or your PhD, discuss your publication schedule with your PI because, there's been cases where people came to us and they said, yeah, I didn't really want to disclose it, but I had to go to this conference and present. So if you have something that you think you want to protect later on, discuss, what conferences you're going to go to. Maybe you go to 2 next year, go to 1 this year to keep it secret. So discuss that ahead of time and really, strategize when and how you're going to publish. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions.
Great. Thank you very much. It certainly comes up a lot when we're thinking of innovation. And sort of the question I alluded to a bit earlier is that I think there's some confusion, and maybe at least for myself and a few of my colleagues here within RI versus McGill and how we handle that. So the RI MUHC has its own contract office, let's say, right, with Ivy Kwan and a whole bunch of other folks there who are wonderful. But then it's unclear when we say, okay, well, that's done, and now we go to McGill. Do we have to still disclose it to the RI that hey, by the way, here's our invention we're going to go over? Do we negotiate now with the RI? There's a new head of innovation. How does that, Alan Forster, how does that fit in now? And so I think there's just a lot of confusion and also uh, uncertainty about who to go to, who to report to, and what is the process.
Yeah, it's a great
Yeah.
question.
So maybe I'll start with that.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. So you're right, the RI has a different contracts office. So you can kind of think of this at the beginning. This is the intake. Those are the people who are negotiating contracts with companies, and that'll be at the beginning of the research project. Where we are is like in the middle or the very end. So you're doing the research project, you have a piece of IP you developed, and you want to report it. Then that's when you report to McGill. You don't need to report to the RI because we let them know. Once you report to our office, we make a file, we communicate in the back channels with them. We don't really have to deal with them anymore, and it's really just with McGill. They do look at our, if we do find an invention, we let them know that they can comment. If we do a license agreement, they comment as well, but you don't actually have to talk to them related to that. When it comes to IP, you really just need to talk to us. Yeah, just McGill. Try and make things as simple as possible. If there's some nuances, some problems, maybe it ties into a future research agreement, right? Oftentimes, you'll report an invention, and let's say it was sponsored by a company, right? Then we'll license to them, but then it will lead to another research agreement, and it goes back to them as well. But really, just focus on us. If we need to bring in the RI, we'll do that. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. Now, in terms of the new innovation parameters happening at the MUHC, I know they're trying to refocus it, but right now that's not changing any processes. So if there is a change, we'll let everybody know. But right now, I think everything is still in development. I think any changes are still, it's going to take a few years, if anything. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. I was just curious whether you have any statistics with you right now to help us understand what types of technologies McGill typically patent.
That's a great question. I don't have off the top of my head. We have done this exercise in the past, but we really patent technologies across the fields. So actually, I think maybe I have some old data later on. I think, let's see. This is old data. So, from 2021, but you can kind of see the proportion of technologies disclosed by faculty. So by far, the faculty of medicine is huge, right? Just because there's so many more researchers in the faculty of medicine, and this also includes dentistry as well. The other half is engineering, and then you have science and agriculture. Let's say in terms of what we actually patent, it's obviously more on the faculty of medicine side, but engineering is quite prolific. So although the number of patents in terms of the engineering side are only about 25%, in the recent years they have increased significantly. But we do patent across the board from medicine to agriculture. There's even one in management. They made a new app. But again, it really depends. If it's software, we don't patent it. That doesn't mean we don't commercialize, right? There's also a lot of inventions related to in medicine related to like cell lines, which you can't really patent, but we do sell them through material transfer agreements. So this is kind of a catch-all term, and like I said, it's old data. But I think at any one time we get around 120 invention disclosures per year, plus or minus maybe 20. We'll spin off maybe about 15 to 20 startups every year. I think right now we have anywhere, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but yeah, we have at least 60 to 80 active startups at any one time. And like in terms of this data, you can see there was 68 active spinoffs. Half of them were in life science, right? So yeah, faculty of medicine is very prolific when it comes to new inventions.
Thank you very much, James. On your slide about how IP costs and revenue sharing works, you had the two options with McGill versus Inventor. But then in the subsequent,
I'll go back to it.
yeah. So this is revenue, and maybe I'm just a little confused about how it's described here. This is revenue sharing for what? Like, so for this piece of IP, for every dollar that will eventually come into this IP, this is how it gets split.
Yeah.
But then how does it work when a couple slides later you say licenses, royalties are negotiable? So those two things seem a little bit contradictory to me. Or is this talking about ownership versus revenue? Maybe can you clarify that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So this is when we receive money from a license agreement. So let's say we'll license to a company. Let's pretend we take 5% royalties for argument's sake. Usually it's royalties or equity and milestones. So whatever dollar we get, 60% of it will go to the inventors. Actually, the first $10,000 goes to the inventors. So this is the net cost. Now, when it comes to royalties, this is what you negotiate for the invention itself, right? So you have, let's say, a new molecule. You'll license it for 5% royalties, you know. So let's say they sell it for $100, right? We get $5. We get 5% royalty. Of that $5, this is how it's split up. Yeah.
That negotiates. That's what's at company X or some other company that wants to take it essentially from McGill.
Yeah, that's right.
I have a so very nice talk. Thanks. I really learned quite a bit. A lot of the people at Core are working in sort of the data science or digital health space rather than the molecule space, or biomarker space, I should say. So I'm trying to wrap my head around almost examples of success stories to get a sense of these are the ideas that could sort of follow this avenue, and these ones are more likely to fail. I know that's sort of what you guys do. That's why you want us to approach you early, but it sounds like the landscape might be shifting towards digital health and like stuff that actually is in our wheelhouse more than, say, new molecules. So do you have examples, or how can we come to know what is when to go to you guys versus just submitting our manuscript to a journal? Like, how do we?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. In terms of success stories in that space, I mean, we have some startups right now in the digital biomarker space right now. I think one a good example is Histern, who went through the McGill Innovation Fund a few times. Right now, they're looking for VC money. There's also been some medical device software. I know that was sold in the past. It was like $1 million they made off of it. But really I'd say the big winners is it's really drugs. I mean, those are the ones that make the most money, but it's the high risk, high reward, right? So I mean, it's a different composition. I mean, in the software space, it's a bit easier, right? Because you have a lot less upfront costs. You don't have to go through clinical trials, right? That type of thing. I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of any in the like the digital biomarker space, but it's also newer, right? It's a newer, I guess, subject matter, right? And oftentimes it's easier to go through the startup route that way because you don't have to put a huge upfront costs, right? So I think there's quite a bit of startups in the digital health space right now. I mean, we launched a lot of them, and right now they're looking for funding. I know some of them were successful. I know one of them raised $1 million recently. One of them raised $5 million in the past 2 years. In terms of direct licenses for software, it's quite difficult, right? Because you have to really license a whole package to a company, right? Unless they want to take like your rough code and kind of develop it further. But what you can ask for that is a lot less than something that's really a product. And oftentimes when it comes to software, that's why people want to go through the startup space to really develop it further, make an actual product that you can license out and you can claim more value for it, right? So I think it's difficult to license software from an academic lab. It's just because it's often you'll just make it on MATLAB, right? It's not it's not something that's you're able to really transfer easily. But there have been cases where that happened. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk and clarifying this. Just moving a little bit in the IP process further downstream, starting with the image on the right there, which is I think where many of us are, where we have something that's successful and it's starting to get traction as a startup, and where McGill and of this. But in the life cycle of such an invention or patent, you move on, you try hired by somebody or merge with somebody. We found an immediate roadblock bring the 20% McGill with us because it doesn't allow us to actually move into that space. So we're now back to McGill negotiating getting rid of the 20%. In other words, paying for the 20%. How is that whole reality
Yeah, so it's
pan
a good
out?
question. So this, if let's say you have a startup, this doesn't mean we have 20% equity in the startup. This is 20% of the agreement you would have between yourselves and the company, right? That could be a company that you're at arm's length with, or it could be your own startup. So, often what we'll do is we'll have an agreement that transfers it with a royalty or with shares. So you have to have that agreement between the inventors and the company because there's a conflict of interest there and it's your own company and that agreement can't be for like $1, let's say. You have to get approval from us. But it's 20% of that agreement. It's not 20% of the company. And it's not 20% of what the company makes. It's 20% of what the inventors make. So there's a distinction there.
Can you explain it a bit more?
Yeah. So if you have a technology, I'm not sure what you have there, but for the digital technology, it's a digital technology, right? The DR. So you have to transfer the IP to your company somehow because right now with the transfer of rights, the inventors own it. Let's just say it's you for argument's sake. It's only you. So now you as a person, you own rights in this technology. You set up a company, the company does not own the rights in it. You have to transfer it to your company. So within that IP transfer agreement, there'll be consideration. And you can pick what the consideration is. It has to be something that's reasonable and something that we would advise on. And let's just say it's, for argument's sake, it's a royalty, 5% royalty. So McGill will take 20% of that 5% royalty. It won't be 20% of the company. So I think it's a very large distinction, right? Yeah. So so if the company makes $100,000, McGill doesn't take 20% of that. Of the royalty, yeah, whatever the royalty or if it's for shares or it's for both, it's of that agreement. So that significantly reduces the burden on the company. Correct. Yeah. Well, I mean, it could be a license. It could be an assignment. Most of the time, it's an assignment. It's cleaner that way. Well, when you have an assignment, the company owns it versus a license. They just have the exclusive right to use it. But if it's your own company, you're gonna want to do an assignment. That's what makes the most sense. But it doesn't necessarily need to be that.
We have a question online.
Sure.
From Dr. Bernatsky. If we are a clinical researcher who is approached by a company looking for clinical data to help them develop a product, is there someone we should reach out to at McGill to know what pitfalls and caveats we should be aware of?
That's a great question. I think reaching out to our office, if you want to go to me or one of my colleagues, happy to give advice at the very beginning. And like I mentioned at the very beginning, I'll go back to that slide if you bear with me. So we have a whole team here, at least at McGill. For the RI, it's the contracts team of the IV Quant. But you can contact Julie or Ivy, and they're there at the very beginning that negotiate the contracts. They know the terms, and they can also help answer those questions because they're really expert on those research agreements. Whereas for us, we're more on the licensing agreement side, management of IP. Happy to answer any questions or refer you to whoever makes the most sense. But I think either technology transfer, research agreements for the McGill side, or the contracts office, the RI, are the best people to give advice.
Thank you for the great talk. So I'm a little bit confused on what is actually patentable, let's say from a basic science perspective. When you identify pathways that could probably cure diseases, do you need to get to the molecule to patent or you can patent things before?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm more on the medical device side, so you'll have to bear with me. in terms of molecules, but yeah, you do need to have the composition of matter. That's kind of the best thing you want. Or a new combination. If you have biomarkers, it's hard to patent that. Digital biomarkers may be a bit easier because you can tie it into like a software to analyze those digital biomarkers. But yeah, you do need that composition of matter. That's the best. That's the best way of patenting it, because then you have exclusivity over that composition of matter exclusively, and then you can also, as a part of the patent can have many different claims in it. So you can have that composition of matter, and you can tie in like the use of it. So in the U.S., for instance, you can actually include claims that you're using this composition of matter to cure this disease, to treat this disease. So not only do you have that composition, but you're the only people who can actually use it to treat a certain disease. It doesn't work in Canada. It doesn't work in all jurisdictions, but that's an example of how you can kind of combine them. But yeah, getting the composition of matter is the best way of doing it. You can have fundamental research that builds up to it. But yeah, it's a bit difficult.
So let's say if you identify a new novel pathway, novel enzyme, right, that's associated with cardiovascular risk, and maybe if you inhibit this pathway or activate it, this enzyme, it can improve outcomes in a variety of fields. So you haven't actually described, I've created this molecule with this molecular structure, but however, you've described for the first time, let's say I have this enzyme, and activating or suppressing that enzyme can help. Like, is that? I'm just trying to delineate what is the novelty component, because often, as scientists, it's hard for us in certain fields to actually come up with the exact drug itself. Like, we're not chemists, but we can identify, hey, this new enzyme actually controls a whole bunch of things, and by knocking it up or down, we can actually influence health.
Yeah, if you can modify the enzyme, then you can potentially patent that. If it's a naturally occurring enzyme, you can't really patent anything that's naturally occurring. If you identify a pathway, you can't like a patent pathway, right? But if you can take advantage of that pathway in some particular way, in a novel way, it's potentially patentable. Yeah.
Last question. So how much proof you need to?
It really depends. It really
I know,
depends
like maybe ideas or examples. Like, does it need to be like,
if you have
figures or
So I mean, I'll go change it to if you bear with me, where the right. So you need like a synthesis scheme, you need like properties and characterizations, potentially in vitro data, some in vivo data if you have like mice models. That also works really well. If it's like a device itself, you need to have a prototype. You need to reduce it to practice. But yeah, you have to really fully describe it in some ways. Now, you don't necessarily need all this information at the very beginning. With the provisional patent application, you have 12 months to add data and add claims. So, if you're like, I'm working on in vitro, I'll get it done in 6 months, you can still start the process. Also, I mean, if it's too early, you can let us know and we can still do an evaluation. Doesn't mean, we can put it on hold if you need more data later on. So, come to us if you want to have a conversation, an idea. Happy to talk with you. And like I mentioned, Salmong, who's our new technology transfer manager, part of her job is actually being something called a innovation broker, where she'll really like go in your lab, try and understand your research, figure out where you are, and really advise you, when you should actually put a disclosure in. And she can have those conversations with you and figure out where you are in terms of the development process, and give you advice early on, and then follow your research, and then figure out when's the best time to actually disclose it and when you should publish.
Thank you, James. Are there any fees associated with reaching out for someone to conduct this evaluation?
Absolutely not, no. Oh yeah, I mean that. I'd say about 3 months, plus or minus a few months. Yeah, it depends on how much information is there, right? So if you have a lot of information, speeds things up a bit more. If we have to, there's a lot of going, back and forth. Hey, we need this, we need that. It might take a bit longer, but yeah, 3 to 4 months, I think is it's our normal timeline. And then to actually file a patent, it could take a patent agent anywhere between 1 to 2 months, depending on the idea. So I think from the day of disclosure to actually getting a provisional patent in, let's say 6 months is a very, let's say it's generous. That's why if you're working on a publication, typically if you're 3 months away, we'll spend that 3 months evaluating it. Maybe you submit it. It's still under, confidentiality once you submit it. The reviewers will probably have some comments, and we'll file provisional before it's patent, before the publication is out there. Sure.
It's actually considered a public disclosure. So, for example, we have our Maurice McGregor Cardiovascular Research Day, right? You've got students put up a poster or something. Like, is that, hey, like students gone up there, they put a poster, that's it? Like the idea's gone, it's out there in the etherverse, or is it's got to be accessible to the public? It's in a peer-reviewed paper, it's in an abstract, it's in a conference. Like, what is the level of threshold? We often have for researchers, exactly like where you're standing, a researcher will sort of say, hey, here's some of my new information. Is that now public disclosure? So can you maybe walk us through that?
That's a great example. So us in this room, we're all part of McGill, we're all part of the RI. This is not a public disclosure if I present my new invention, because we're all, it's an expectation of confidentiality. We're all within the same organization. But if you go to a conference, international conference, and you have a poster, that's a public disclosure. If you have a paper, peer-reviewed paper, public disclosure. If you talk to a company, just one person at a different company, it's a public disclosure. If your research day, it might be just for McGill, but anybody can kind of walk in and see the poster. It's technically a public disclosure, right? If anybody can just kind of off the street look at it. And for instance, if let's say I had a new invention here with us in this room or online, this is within McGill. But then if this video goes on YouTube, it's a disclosure. And in addition, there's new rulings. If you put your invention in ChatGPT, it's actually a disclosure. So, because now you're putting it out there, and technically, OpenAI would own it. So yeah, there's a lot of things that can be a disclosure. But if you're just having a conversation, if you're within a lab discussing it, if you're within McGill presenting it, it's typically fine, especially if there's no online record. But yeah, if you're at a conference, research day, you have a paper, obviously it's disclosed, then yeah.
Great. Thank you, James. Are there any questions? Or any remaining questions? Yes, please.
So how much non-obvious the information can be defined as? I can give an example. For example, you have a pathway that you suspected to reflect on disease A or B, but then you are working on a molecule that impacts this pathway. Can you, let's say, present this pathway in the conferences and then work on the molecule to patent, or presenting it, the pathway itself can also, perish this entire journey?
You have to be very careful about suggesting what you're working on. So if you're still working on developing the composition of matter and you're not presenting it, right? Let's say you're still developing it, but you talk about your future work, that actually could be considered disclosure. So suggesting what you're going to be like, I'm going to be working on this and it's going to do this, and I'm thinking of doing it this way, but I'm not too sure yet. Yeah, they can actually be considered disclosure. So often what patent reviewers do will look at your previous publications, and they'll look at your like discussion point. What am I going to do next? They do look at that. I'm serious. So you have to be obviously with your publication, you want to do that, right? Like it's advantageous, but from a patent perspective, from a disclosure perspective, you don't really want to mention what you're doing in the future. Yeah. And I'll give you an example, sort of an obvious one. So there was technology that was disclosed to our office, and it was a way of freeze drying cannabis, right, to reduce the curing time. So the person had a humidity sensor to analyze the cannabis. They freeze dry it until it hit a certain point, and then that's when it was ready. So was it novel? Yes. No one really done this before, but they're using a humidity sensor to measure the humidity of a piece of cannabis. It's obvious. So you couldn't move forward with it, right? So, and often things are usually novel, but they're obvious. It's sometimes it's not usually the other way around where like, no, it's not obvious, but it's not novel. It's you can make an argument for novelty for many things, but it's the obvious is really the hurdle. And that's usually where we get pushback from a patent examiner.
Great. Thank you, James.
It has to be both, right? But yeah, it has to be both.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank
We're
you.
out of time. Thank you everyone for coming. Our next course seminar is on January the 20th. Just an FYI.